Little Miss Mouse by Amy Ella Blanchard. Chapter 7. A Surprise Party. The news was soon noised abroad among Ruth's playmates that she had another doll, exactly like Henrietta, and because there was some mystery about it, as well as because the doll was unlike others of the period, Hetty was quite a belle for a time, though Ruth determined never to take her to school again, lest Nora's spite should work her ill. She did take her over to Annie Waite's one day, where she found Nora, who, with some other little girls, had been invited to spend the afternoon. Perceiving her enemy, Ruth ran home again after a whispered consultation with Annie. Nora looked rather shamefaced when Ruth returned without her doll, but she said nothing, and as Annie lent Ruth one of her dolls to play with, everyone was supplied. This was really a surprise party for Ruth, for Annie had found out that it was her birthday, and, knowing that Miss Hester could not very well afford parties, had begged her mother to let her have a simple little affair with Ruth as guest of honor. It was a great occasion for Ruth, who did not remember ever having a party before, and she was quite overcome when she came back and found that both Annie and Lucia had provided gifts for her. Lucia gave her a box of candy, temptingly tied up in white paper with blue ribbons, and Annie gave her a doll, prettily dressed and small enough to carry in her pocket, while Charlotte Bingham brought her a big bunch of chrysanthemums. "Let's dress up," proposed Annie, suddenly, when they were at the end of their resources, having played Mother and Old Witch and a dozen other things. "I'll get Sister to let us have some of her old things and we'll be ladies." "No, let's be queens," put in Lucia. "We don't all want to be queens," returned Annie. "It would be funny to have so many. Some ought to be maids of honor." "Then we'll choose a queen. I vote for Ruth. It's her birthday." "I vote for her too," chimed in Annie. "Humph," exclaimed Nora, tossing her head. "I don't then. I reckon I'm not going to be maid to any "You just hush," cried Lucia, putting her hand over Nora's mouth. "She is just as good as you are, and a great deal better. Her grandfather never—" She paused, for she realized that it was very rude to quarrel with Annie's guests. So she turned and said, "I'll tell you what we'll do, Annie. We'll have 2 queens. You and I will be Ruth's maids of honor, and the others can choose their queen. Then we can go on splendid journeys to visit each other." "All right," agreed the rest. "That will be fine. We'll choose you, Nora," said Angeline McBride. "Won't we, Charlotte?" Charlotte consented, and Annie rushed off to get the proper trappings for their play. Her sister, Isabel, always had a store of these on hand for just such occasions, so presently Annie returned with her arms piled high with all sorts of stuff: old velveteen skirts, discarded evening wraps, scarves, shawls, and jackets. She threw these down in a heap on the lounge. "Now help yourselves," she said. "Queens take first choice, maids next. Go ahead, Ruth, and pick out what you want." "I'm just as much a queen as she is," grumbled Nora. "But Ruth was the first chosen," argued Lucia. "I don't care if she was. I won't play if I can't have first choice," pouted Nora, who had her eye on a blue velvet skirt. "Oh, let her choose first if she wants to," said Ruth with some disdain. "She'll need the best things she can get to make her look like anybody," she said, in an aside to Lucia. Lucia giggled, and Nora shot them an angry look, but began to turn over the things on the lounge, selecting this, discarding that, till finally Lucia broke in with, "Here, you can't do that way, Nora. Can she, Annie? She is picking out the very best things and isn't leaving anything for anyone else. She can't wear 2 velvet skirts." "No, that's not the way," said Annie, seeing how things were going. "You can only choose one thing at a time." Nora protested, but was overruled by the others, so she stood undecided between a blue velveteen skirt and a red fur-trimmed cloak. Finally, deciding upon the former, and Ruth was awarded the cloak. Nora's next choice fell upon a pink silk waist, while Ruth chose a dim old brocaded skirt with golden lights through it. At this, Nora had cast a contemptuous look, but in it Ruth saw possibilities and added to her choice a pale green waist and a floating scarf. She found, too, a gold crown which fitted her little head and some dazzling ornaments. It took some time to select, and then the two queens with their finery, carried by their maids, took possession of different rooms. There was some squabbling as to who should be the visiting queen, but finally Nora carried the day. When she entered Ruth's presence, however, she was sorry she had not elected to remain in her own kingdom. For Ruth, seated upon a gilt chair, which was mounted upon a window box covered with rugs, arose to meet her in such magnificence as quite crushed Nora for the moment. Upon her head glittered the crown, her rippling chestnut hair falling below it. A gold-embroidered scarf floated from her shoulders, while the red fur-trimmed cloak swept as a long train far behind her, opening in front to show the brocaded skirt. Around her waist was a jeweled belt, and in her hand she held a scepter, which Miss Isabel had hastily prepared for her from a stick and some gold paint. Nora's rather short blue velvet train was held up by Charlotte. Her pink waist looked somewhat dowdy and contrasted badly with the blue skirt. She wore no crown upon her head, only a chiffon hat trimmed with musk flowers, and the cloak which she wore, being of a terracotta hue, gave a combination of colors which was anything but pleasant to look upon. "Doesn't she look a sight?" whispered Lucia. Ruth nodded, and then swept to meet her guest with a haughtiness which was not all put on. Nora tried to courtesy, but in doing so bumped against Charlotte, who still held the train, and the two tumbled over together to the amusement of the rest. "I think it is a silly, horrid play," cried Nora, picking herself up, "and I'm not going to be in it." "I shouldn't think you would want to be," said Lucia scornfully, and Nora dashed from the royal presence in anything but a dignified manner. "The idea of her trying to look like a queen," said Lucia loftily. "She looks more like an old crazy woman. Now, Ruth is just as queenly as anything. Isn't she fine, Angeline? She knew just what would look well." "She does look nice," Angeline confessed. Ruth extended her scepter. "You may ask a favor of us," she said, after the manner of a fairy queen she had read about. "Your wish shall be granted." Angeline laughed. "I don't believe you could grant many wishes." "Oh, let's just pretend," put in Annie. "Well, I wish for a pony." "We will conduct our guest to the royal stable and let her select for herself," said Ruth, quick to perceive a toy horse in the closet at the end of the room, for this, being the playroom, held the children's toys. She walked with great stateliness across the floor and flung open the closet door, disclosing a horse and cart, a horse on wheels, and a tin affair with two horses abreast dragging a fire engine. The girls shrieked with laughter, but Ruth turned a grave countenance upon them. "Oh, do pretend," she said. "What's the use of playing if we don't make believe? You mustn't laugh that way. It keeps it from being real." But as no one possessed sufficient imagination to see anything but the funny side of it, Angeline's wish was not granted. "I wonder what's become of Charlotte and Nora," said Annie. "They went back to my room to take off their hats and things." "I don't believe they are going to play queen anymore," said Angeline. "We might have tableaux or charades," suggested Lucia. "I'll go find the others and tell them," said Annie. "You be picking out a play while I'm gone." They were talking the matter over when Annie returned with her two missing guests. "We are going to play robbers or something and carry off a lovely lady to a cave," announced Lucia. "Ruth's the smallest, and she'll be the easiest to carry." "Oh, I think that's Line," said Annie. "What will you be, Lucia?" "I am going to be the young knight who rescues her, "And I'll be the chief of the robber band," said Nora. "Or maybe I'll be the old woman that's always ready to receive the prisoners. You know there is always one like that in the stories." Annie, Charlotte, and Angeline, therefore, resolved themselves into a band of robbers, and Ruth, in her queenly robes, was dragged off unmercifully. Annie's room became the robber's den, and the closet therein, the special corner where the princess was bestowed. It was a large light closet with a transom over the door and held, besides clothing, a trunk, and several boxes. "Now, don't you let anyone come and take away our prisoner or steal our treasure," ordered the robbers, when Ruth had been safely disposed in the den. "Shall we bind her hand and foot?" asked Charlotte. Oh, yes. Nora was ready to add anything she could to Ruth's discomfort. She had quite enjoyed the process of dragging Ruth to the den and treating her harshly. "No, we won't bind her," Annie decided. "It will be too uncomfortable. It's bad enough to shut her up." "So then, Aisha," said Lucia, addressing Nora, "we will go and hunt wild beasts. Guard the prisoner well, and you shall have part of the ransom." With this, the three stalked off, leaving Nora in possession. With Ruth safe under lock and key, and the night not to be expected just yet, for there was to be a fight on the borders of the forest before he could arrive, Nora found it rather stupid in Annie's room. Upon the bed lay Ruth's red coat, which Nora secretly admired. She tried it on and viewed herself in the glass. She filled out the coat more than Ruth did, and considered that she looked vastly better in it. Tired of admiring herself, she turned to something else to amuse her. There was the daintily wrapped box which Lucia had given Ruth, and which she had begged Ruth not to open till she reached home. Nora's curiosity got the better of her. She would like to see just what was in it. Listening all the while, she stealthily untied the blue ribbons and lifted the lid. The candies looked delicious. She took out one and smelled it. Just then the robbers came clambering up, and she hastily threw Ruth's coat over box and lid. "Is all well, Aisha?" asked Annie in a gruff voice. "All's well," she answered, her heart beating fast. "There are no skulking thieves about to rob us of our gains?" "No, sir," returned Nora, cringingly. "She actually acts as if she were afraid of us," laughed Angeline, who with fierce burned cork eyebrows and mustache looked quite terrible. "Guard our cave well, there are plunderers about," charged Annie. "Come, comrades, we must to the chase. Let no one so much as put a foot across the sill, my honest Aisha," said Angeline. "We can trust you with our treasures, but no one else. If so much as a dog approaches, drive him out." And they clattered off again. Nora listened till they were out of hearing, then she lifted the coat and drew forth the box. She could not resist popping one very fat chocolate into her mouth. It would never be missed. It tasted very good. She wished that it were her birthday and that someone had brought her such a box of candy. She shook the box a little, and some of the pieces being disarranged, the lid would not shut down tightly. Nora could not set aside the opportunity which this gave her. One tall and toothsome piece of candy seemed to be the specially annoying one which prevented the lid from fitting. She would eat that, and even then the box would look full. But just as she had slipped it into her mouth, a voice from somewhere above her, it sounded in midair, said mockingly, "Honest Aisha." Overcome with fright, Nora dropped the box on the bed and the contents rolled out. "Let me out! Let me out, you mean piggy child?" came from the top of the closet, and looking up, Nora saw Ruth's face at the transom. She had piled up some of the boxes upon the trunk and had climbed upon them to peep through, thinking to surprise Nora, which she very effectually had done. "Let me out this minute," she cried, "or I will tell on you." "Oh, please don't," begged Nora, overcome with shame. I was only just going to taste them. They looked so good." "Oh, I saw you," declared Ruth. I saw you when you opened the box, and when you tried on my coat that you pretend you don't like. You seem to think you looked very fine in it." "Oh, Ruth, please don't tell the others," whimpered Nora. "Let me out then so I can pick up my candies. I don't want you to touch another one. Hurry up now, or the others will be back." Thus admonished, Nora unlocked the door, and Ruth, with a haughtiness to which the costume added effect, swept past her. She carefully replaced the candies, tied up the box, and put it on a shelf in the closet. "I don't dare trust you," she told Nora. "You are just the one to play at being a robber, only you don't have to play at it. You needn't lock me in. I'll stay, for I don't like your company." Nora was quite crushed. Ruth had her in her power, and, though she inwardly raged, she knew that words would only bring future mortification to her. She was very sure that Ruth would not tell, though there was no reason that she should not. She was obliged to acknowledge, and her thoughts were far from agreeable. She did not have long to sit in silence, for presently the robbers came storming back, followed by the rescuing knight who slew them. One by one, so that they fell in a limp heap just inside the door, and with no sort of protest from the guarding Aisha, Ruth was delivered from her imprisonment. At this moment came word that certain good things were ready to be served in the dining room, so there was much flurry in getting rid of superfluous garments, burned cork mustaches, and such things. In the confusion and hurry, no one noticed Nora's extremely meek demeanor, nor Ruth's contemptuous looks. It was, however, an occasion which neither one ever forgot, and Ruth's former dislike to Nora was increased that day for more than one reason. After this, Nora no longer openly annoyed her, but, in fact, tried to avoid her, and consequently, there were more peaceful times at school for Ruth. However, she did not refrain from expressing her scorn of Nora to Billy when she reached home after her surprise party. "She is a piggy child," she said. "She looked all over the plate of cake and took the best piece, and she did the same way when the grapes were passed. She took the biggest, nicest bunch. All the girls noticed it. She may call me a charity child if she likes, but I call her a piggy child. Aunt Hester tells us it is ill-bred to act so greedily. Lucia and Annie never do so. They always leave the best for others. Nora is a piggy child, and I never want to have anything to do with her." Truth to tell, circumstances soon arose which forbade Ruth for a long time having more to do with any of her schoolmates, for there were changes in store for her. Chapter 8. A Strange Visitor. It was the next day after her surprise party that Ruth was running after Stray, who had wriggled under the gate and had scampered down the street with Ruth in hot pursuit and calling, "Stray, Stray, naughty dog, come back." The little girl knew that he would probably come back in his own good time, but she and Billy did not like him to associate with certain evilly disposed curs around in the next street, and, moreover, he was still such a little fellow, ready to make friends with anyone who encouraged a friendship, that they were afraid he might be picked up and carried off. Fast though Ruth's legs hurried, Stray's fork carried him faster, but his career came to a full stop when a man coming in an opposite direction caught him and held him fast, till Ruth ran up panting. "Oh, thank you for catching Stray," she said. "He is only in fun, of course, but we don't like him to get into the next street. There are so many bad dogs there." "And you must look out for his morals," returned the man, lifting himself from where he was bending over holding the squirming Stray. "What's your name?" he asked sharply, and dropping his jocose tone while he bent a keen look upon the child. "Ruth Henrietta Brackenberry," came the reply promptly enough. The man drew in his breath sharply. "Ruth," he said. "That was her name too, and I think she would have looked much like you." "Your little girl, do you mean? Is she dead?" Ruth asked. "I am afraid so." "Oh, don't you know?" The man shook his head and walked along by Ruth's side as she dragged the unwilling stray toward home. "Do you live near here?" he asked presently. "Yes, just around the corner. We used to live in that big house." She nodded toward the white pillars which showed between the russet-brown leaves of the oaks. "And why did you leave there?" asked the man pleasantly. "The Major died, and Aunt Hester didn't have enough money to live there, so she and Billy and I came to the little brown house. It is a nice little house, only it isn't very big." "Billy is your brother?" "No, not exactly. He is almost, though," returned Ruth a little doubtfully. She did not want to seem to deny Billy. "His name is Billy Beatty," she added. "I suppose then he is a nephew of your aunt, as you are her niece." Yes. Ruth felt that this was quite the truth. "Your aunt's name is Brackenberry, then, or is it Beatty?" asked the man abruptly after a few minutes' silence. "It is Brackenberry." Ruth wondered at the many questions. "This is where I live," she told him when they had reached the gate. "Goodbye. Thank you very much for helping me catch Stray." Then, as the man stood looking at her with that same searching expression, she felt impelled to ask, "What was your little girl's name?" "It wasn't my own little girl of whom I was thinking, but of the child of my dead brother, my little niece, Ruth Mayfield, who might well have looked like you." Very pale and with eyes burning, Ruth backed away, then turned and fled into the house, giving but one backward fearful look. The man looked after her thoughtfully for a moment, and then slowly moved away. Ruth ran through the kitchen to her own little room, which opened out of it. She took off her hat and coat and threw them on the bed. Then she crowded herself behind a chair into a corner, as if she would get out of sight of and as far away as possible from everyone. She felt much as she did when a certain bad dream haunted her. In it, she was always fleeing from a crazy man who pursued her with a sword. She was troubled and afraid. Mayfield, that was her own name before she had been given that of Brackenberry. She crouched in her corner, thinking. Who was this man? Not her father, of course, because he had said it was his niece of whom she reminded him. Any relatives that she might have had she remembered but vaguely. She had a dim recollection of a grandmother, of a Christmas day when she was about 3 years old and when uncles and aunts had given her presents. But a child forgets such things very soon, and relationships are difficult to grasp at a tender age. Of course, this man might be her own uncle, or perhaps there were other little Ruth Mayfields in the world. At all events, she determined to say nothing about the man to Miss Hester or Billy, for a great fear was in her heart that he might want to take her away. If he did attempt such a thing and she were warned of it, she reflected that she would hide somewhere till he gave up the search. She sat long in her corner, pondering over these dreadful possibilities, till it began to grow dusk, and she heard Miss Hester stirring about the kitchen, making ready for supper. Then duty called her. She must set the table, and she crept out blinking as she faced the light in the room. "What a little mouse you have been. Were you asleep, Ruth?" said Miss Hester as she came in. "No, Aunt Hester," returned the child soberly. "I was only thinking. You were so quiet that I didn't even know you were in the house. How long have you been in?" "I was just thinking of sending Billy to hunt you up. No wonder Dr. Peasley calls you Miss Mouse. You slip around just like one." "I've been in, I don't know just how long. It wasn't a bit dark when I came. I saw you running after Stray, and that was my last glimpse of you. I came right back. Pretty soon, I mean, and then I came in the house after I had shut Stray in the woodshed. I must go let him out, poor doggy. He was so miserable, Aunt Hester, for he knew he was being punished for running away." Just then, Billy came in, Stray at his heels. The dog nosed Ruth fawningly, with much wagging of tail and twisting of body, as if trying to become on good terms with her again. Presently, a knock at the front door sent Billy to answer. He came back directly. "A gentleman wants to see you, Aunt Hester," he reported. Ruth started and looked around tremblingly. "What does he look like?" she whispered when Miss Hester had left the room. "I couldn't see very well," Billy answered. "Was he tall, and did he wear a gray overcoat?" "Oh, Billy," she paused. "What's the matter? You look like something was after you," said Billy. "Maybe something is," returned Ruth. "Oh, you silly," Billy spoke contemptuously. "Do you hear a mouse, or what is the matter?" "No, I don't hear anything, but, oh, never mind, I'll tell you sometime." "You girls are always getting up some mystery," said the boy. "Say, I'm awful hungry, and that man is staying the mischief of a time. What do you suppose he wants?" Ruth hesitated, then she fixed her solemn eyes upon Billy. "He wants me, I expect," she said impressively. Billy gave her a look. "Say, look here. What are you up to? Is it some sort of make-believe like you and Lucia are always playing?" "No, it isn't. Come over here by the woodbox, Billy, and I'll tell you if you promise not to breathe it to a soul." "All right. Fire ahead. Cross your heart you won't tell." Billy went through the ceremony with due solemnity, and then Ruth poured forth her surprising story, ending with, "And so, I'm awfully afraid he has come to take me away." "Maybe he's got loads of money," returned the practical Billy. "And maybe he's got a fine house and a horse and carriage and all that." "Oh, I don't believe that. And anyhow, do you suppose if he has that I would want to leave Aunt Hester?" The same passionate love and loyalty that Ruth had given her mother, she was beginning to bestow upon Miss Hester. "Besides," she went on, "I'm named Brackenberry now, and I can't have two names anymore." "Oh, well, don't let's suppose any more till we know for sure," said Billy. "Perhaps it isn't the same man at all, and if it is, perhaps he wouldn't want you to leave here. Say, don't let's wait for her to come out to supper. I'm half-starved, and we won't have time for our lessons before bedtime if we don't begin soon. You can keep the tea hot, can't you?" "Yes, of course. We might eat our supper, I suppose, and then we can wash up the dishes we have soiled and let Aunt Hester's stand." This they concluded to do, and it was well they did, for nearly 2 hours passed before the door closed behind the stranger, and the children had finished studying their lessons when Miss Hester returned to them. Billy was nodding over his spelling book, but Ruth's eyes were big and bright. She put down her geography and ran to Miss Hester, clasped her waist and looked up into her face with pleading eyes. Miss Hester stooped to kiss her, but she gave no explanation of her visitor's errand. "You ate your supper?" she said. "That was right. I didn't realize how late it was." She drank a cup of tea and ate a bit of bread as if she were not aware of what she was doing, her face very thoughtful meanwhile. After her meal, she sat still, lost in thought, Ruth watching her furtively. Presently, Miss Hester roused herself. "It is time you children were in bed," she said. "Run along, Billy. You look sleepy enough to drop off on the stairs. Come, Ruth." She arose to give Billy his goodnight kiss, after which he stumbled up the stairway, and then she sat down again and held out her arms to Ruth, who threw herself into them and hid her face. "You knew, my little girl, didn't you?" said Miss Hester softly. "I saw that you did as soon as I came in." Ruth's arms went tight around her neck. "Will he take me away? Will he, Aunt Hester?" She began to sob. "Oh, don't let him. Don't." Miss Hester drew a long sigh and held the child closer. "It is a difficult question, my little girl," she said. But, I am your own little girl. I am named Brackenberry. You said so. You told me you were just exactly the same as my mother, and my mother wouldn't let me go. Oh, no, she would never have done it. And I shall not, if I can help it, dear." We will not talk of it tonight. I am to see your uncle again. One thing is sure, you shall not leave me unless you are willing to go." "Then I never will." Ruth pressed her cheek against Miss Hester's. "I am yours, your little girl, and nobody else's. My name is Ruth Henrietta Brackenbury. It is. It surely is. Come, do not think about it any more tonight. You shall stay with me always, if after your uncle has talked to you, it seems to be the thing that you most want to do." Ruth felt sure that no amount of talking could shake her decision, and if it depended upon herself, she need have no fears, so she felt comforted. "He is my real uncle, then," she said. "Yes, I think there is no doubt of it. Come, you must go to bed. Billy is probably asleep before this." But though to bed Ruth went, it was not to go to sleep. Her eyes seemed propped wide open. There were 100 questions she wanted to ask, and she was sure that she could never wait till morning to ask them. She heard the rockers of Miss Hester's chair going squeaky squeak, squeaky squeak upon a loose board in the floor. She wondered if she were at work upon the buttonholes she disliked so much, or what she was doing. After what seemed to her hours of lying still, listening to the monotonous squeak, Ruth crept out of bed and stole to the door. Miss Hester, her head against the back of the chair, her eyes fixed on space, was still rocking back and forth. Her hands held no work. Her supper dishes stood unwashed. Such a condition of affairs displayed an unusual state of mind. Miss Hester was never idle, and to leave one's supper dishes unwashed was a sign that something far beyond the ordinary must be the matter. If it were certain that Ruth was not to leave her adopted mother, why this anxious countenance, these troubled eyes and unsmiling mouth? The child crept nearer. The slight noise she made aroused Miss Hester. "Why, child," she said, "what are you doing up? You should have been asleep long ago." "I couldn't go to sleep," Ruth replied. "My eyes would pop open. I counted ever so many, up to 1,000, I think, and I tried to see sheep jumping over a fence, like you did that time you told the doctor you couldn't sleep, but I just wanted to ask you so many questions that I couldn't think of anything else." "Get my big shawl to wrap around you and come satisfy your curiosity, if that is what is troubling you," said Miss Hester, smiling. Ruth padded back to Miss Hester's room, found the shawl, and trailed back with the fringe tickling her bare ankles. She climbed into Miss Hester's lap and stuck her feet out toward the stove, in which a fire still burned. "I want to know first," she began, "how that man knows he is my uncle. He was attracted to you by your likeness to your father and the name of Ruth. When he left you, he went back to the hotel and inquired into your history. Mrs. Green, of course, knew all about you and gave him a full account of how you came to be my little girl. When she told him that he ought to have been satisfied," Ruth commented, "he oughtn't to have come here bothering us. What did he do it for, when he knew I truly belonged to you? Because he had promised your father to try to find you and your mother. He traced you both to Elder Street and learned that your mother had died there and that you had been taken away. What's become of my father, and why didn't he come back to us?" Ruth spoke resentfully. "He meant to come," your uncle said, "but he had a hard time of it, and was not one to be very successful in this world. He was taken ill out west, and, when he knew he could not live, he sent word to your uncle, who went out and stayed with him till he died. Before that, your father had written to your mother, but his letter was returned. It was just before he died that your uncle promised to find you and your mother, and if either were living to do all he could for you. Your uncle said that up to that time he had no idea that his brother had left home. He had not heard from him for 2 or 3 years, for they lived quite far apart, and your uncle, being a successful man, had no patience with your father, who was unsuccessful. He felt that your father had been extravagant in spending all the money which had been left him by his father, and told him he must shift for himself. Do you understand all this, Ruth? Yes, I think so. Mother said father wasn't a bad man. No, I don't think he was. Only foolish and extravagant, with no idea of business. Instead of living simply on the income from his money, he lived beyond his means, invested his money foolishly, and lost it all. Then, with the idea that he could make another fortune, he left home only to become worse off and to die among strangers. I suppose, said Ruth sagely after a short silence, that he didn't like to come home till he had some money to bring Mother, and he never came because he hadn't any to bring. That is about the way it was. It wasn't very kind, though, to leave Mother alone, said Ruth. I think he ought to have stayed to take care of her, or else he ought to have taken us with him. It would seem so, dear, but I think he couldn't bear to have your mother earning money to support him. It would have been another to feed. Before he went away, she was earning a little by writing for newspapers. Ruth nodded. She remembered the constant writing, interrupted by the haunting cough. She sat thinking it all over. After a time, she turned suddenly. One more to feed does make a difference. Billy says so. Yes, I am sorry to say it does, returned Miss Hester with a sigh. Then I don't think Father was so very wrong, said the child maturely. I can love him and be sorry for him, if that is why he went away. And I think that is the way Mother felt too. She knew he meant to come back. I will go to bed now, Aunt Hester. She slipped down from Miss Hester's lap, but as she trailed through the door to her room, she stopped. There's one more thing I'd like to ask, Aunt Hester. When is the man, my uncle, coming to see me? Tomorrow. How did he happen to come here to look for me? He wasn't looking for you, but you happened to come in his way while he was in the town on business. He says, though, that he never has failed to look for you everywhere he has been. Now, is that all? You will not want to get up in the morning? Ruth nodded gravely and crept into bed again, her mind full of old memories and new thoughts.